Welcome to Uniquely Female Troubles. My name is Leslie Wells. Before I start talking today, I want to let you know that a man named Charles Paisley, who is a minister, and he used to be in the cult that I used to be in. He was a leader in that cult and a minister then too. And he has released a 10-minute video that summarizes very concisely who William Branham was, who was the leader of the cult I was in, and what the cult that we were both in, him and me, not together though, I didn't know him back then, is about. And from now on, I'm going to put a link to that video in every video description of every video that I release. That way you can have a quick, easy to digest summary about this group. Which is very interesting that this is the first time I'm announcing that, because this video is about what is a cult. I mean, that's a word that we use and we throw around a lot, but what really is a cult? And I think something that's very interesting about the word cult is people have their own idiosyncratic definitions of the word. Like they can just decide what a cult is. But a cult actually has a meaning in the dictionary, just like every other word, and it is not a matter of what a person thinks is a cult. And I have heard people say, well, according to my idea of what a cult is, and then go off on some tangent that is not accurate. Or I've heard somebody say, well, if a church doesn't teach the Trinity, then they have to be a cult. And I've heard people just say all kinds of things. And of course, people who are in cults do not agree that their group is a cult. But if it meets the criteria of a cult, it is a cult. So first I'm going to read you the dictionary definition, and I have two of them here. No, three. The first one is a system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object. With that definition, every religion is a cult. But the way we're using the word cult here is actually shorthand for the destructive cult. But what people like to do is they will look up the word cult and they'll see this as like, well, oh, every religion is a cult, of course, because obviously, all religions do venerate something or someone. The second definition is a little bit closer to a destructive cult. It says a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister. So again, this is a very subjective thing because it says it's regarded by others. So you could have a group say you have a group in two different countries and they're doing exactly the same thing. And the other people in one of the countries considers it strange and sinister. According to this definition, then that group would be a cult. But if the people in the other country do not find the practices of this group strange or sinister, they would not be a cult. That makes it incredibly subjective, and it's not a very good definition at all. The third definition is a misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or thing. For instance, we've all know of movies being called cult classics, and we all know about different things that are considered cult this, cult that, and that just means that it has a very devoted following. So again, when we use the word cult to describe groups that hurt people, the real full definition of it is destructive cult. And I'm going to talk about the criteria that two different cult experts have come up with. The first man I'm going to talk about his name is Rick Alan Ross. And he actually used to be involved in forcibly deprogramming people, which is no longer practiced because people go to jail for that. And you are depriving the person of their rights. You're actually kidnapping them with a good motive, but at the same time, it's against law. And I know there have been many forcible deprogrammings that did work, and there have been many that didn't work. So Rick Allen Ross, who is the head of the Cult Awareness Network, until a whole bunch of crazy things happened with the Church of Scientology, who actually took that over, he has three things. He has three things that if a group has this, it is a cult, a destructive cult. The first one is an absolute authoritarian leader. The leader becomes the object of worship beyond questioning, and he dictates the group's beliefs and actions. That is his first criteria for a cult. They might not become an actual literal object of worship, or they might, but they are definitely not anybody you can question or correct or criticize. The second criteria is coercive persuasion. The leader uses thought reform techniques or brainwashing to undermine critical thinking and foster dependency on the leader or the group. And the third criteria, which I think is the most important, is the exploitation and harm. The leader uses people to do things that harm themselves but benefit the leader or the group. And that is pretty objective. If somebody tells me to give them all their money and I do, then I'm hurting myself and I'm helping them. And if they're using thought reform techniques to get me to do this, then I would say that is very cultic. It's not every single group that is a destructive cult has a central leader. Almost every one of them does, or they have one that has died and they're still continuing on in his name, but some of them don't even have that. And also, not all destructive cults are religious. That's what we think of automatically when we think of a cult. But a destructive cult can be religious, it can be political, it can be a self-help group, a personal growth and transformation group, an MLM or multi-level marketing group, a psychology group. Any group can become a cult. You could be in a club that's, I don't know, about everybody who loves chess. And if someone manages to maneuver themselves into the authoritarian leadership of this group and they start using thought reform techniques on the members and it turns into that, a chess club could become a cult. And there are two-person cults. There are about 10,000 religious cults in the U.S. right now as we speak, and nobody's heard of most of them. But there's an even more common kind of cult, and that is one that either just consists of one family or it consists of just two people. And it can be a romantic couple. The husband could be the cult leader, the wife could be the cult follower. The wife could be the cult leader, the husband could be the cult follower. Often the dad of a family becomes the cult leader, and his wife and children, and then they grow up, they get married, their children, their spouses. It's happened that a patriarch of a family ends up turning it into a cult. And often they will take that family and live out in isolation somewhere. That's something that's pretty common in these family cults. And like I said, it doesn't have to be a religion. And I want to ask you a question, a hypothetical question. If there was a church that was formed 2 months ago and it had 10 members and their main doctrine is that rocks are sacred and that we pray to them and we worship them and we never ever step on them because we don't want to hurt them, would that be a cult? According to some of the definitions, it would. And one of the newer ways of calling a group a cult, they don't want to use the word cult because it has so many negative connotations. that they're calling it a new religious movement. It would definitely be a new religious movement because it had only started 2 months ago. Another thing that some people like to say is that the difference between a cult and a religion is that a cult hasn't been around very long and it doesn't have many members. But a religion has been around a long time and it has lots of members. And that is just not true. That is absolutely not true. Another thing that's not true is that the cult is a cult based on their theology, based on their teachings. We are going to focus in on religious cults because I was in a religious cult for 28 years. And that's what we're talking about today, a destructive religious cult. But before we go too further, as far as the two-person cults, anyone who's watching this that has Netflix, there is a documentary series on there called Bad Vegan. And if you want to see an example of a two-person cult, then watch that documentary. It is unbelievable what this guy got this very successful lady to believe and to do to her own downfall. It's really sad, but it so illustrates the power that one person can have over another person. We think nobody could do that to us, but you know what? This lady owned restaurants. She was super successful, and yet she became part of a two-person cult. And until recently, people didn't really even talk about two-person cults, but they're a thing. They're a real thing. The other expert I want to talk about is named Stephen Hassan, and he was a 19-year-old college student, and his girlfriend had broken up with him, and he got recruited into the Mooney cult, also called the Unification Church, and he was in that cult, I don't know, like 2 or 3 years, and he rose up in leadership of the cult. And he was forcibly deprogrammed, and it worked. And then he went back to college, and he got his degree in psychology, and he became a cult expert. And I consider him the leading cult expert in the world right now, at least in the US maybe. But he has a very interesting definition of a cult, and it's called the BITE model. B stands for behavior. They control your behavior. Now, I'm going to give you the example of the cult I was in. It was called the End Time Message, and the central figure is William Branham, who actually died in 1965. And yes, this cult is much bigger than it was when he died. So, what did they control about our behavior? Well, they told us how to dress. I did a video about the rules they had of dress, which I'll link that in the description of this video. And for instance, I had to stop wearing pants. I had to start only wearing dresses or skirts or jumpers. I could not wear pants or shorts. They don't allow men and women to go swimming together. And you're not allowed to wear a swimsuit. If you are like out in the ocean or somewhere, obviously there are other people in the ocean of the opposite gender. But you have to go in the ocean in your clothes. And if you want to find out what it feels like to get stared at like you're a total weirdo, then just walk into the ocean fully dressed. And you will find out what it feels like to be stared at because you are a weirdo. And I've done that many times. They controlled what books we could read. They controlled what movies we were allowed to see. We were not allowed to have a TV or go to movies. And they controlled, we were not allowed to smoke, take recreational drugs. We were not allowed to drink. We were not allowed to go bowling. There were just some kind of an unbelievably long list of rules of what we were allowed to do and what we weren't allowed to do. Some of them I didn't even know about because different branches of this cult, now that the central leader is dead, have kind of gone off in their own directions, and some of the rules were not kept in or talked about in the cult branch that I was in. So that's B, behavior. I stands for information, access to information. So access to information is very important for a cult because they can't have you finding out the truth about who they are and what they do and all their lies. For instance, Scientology claims that they have millions of members all over the world. Yet, if you go on the internet and research it, you'll find out they only have between like 25,000 and 35,000 members all over the world. That is tiny compared to the cult I was in. But because of people like Tom Cruise and the other famous people that have been in Scientology, it's a very well-known cult. And it's a very dangerous cult too. And so a Mormon, a Scientologist, a Jehovah's Witness person, the people that were in the cult I was in, you're not allowed to just go online and find out what everybody's saying about your group. You're only allowed to look at the approved websites that are given to you by your group. You do not have freedom. You do not have the freedom to access any information that you want to access. And like I said earlier, we were not allowed to watch movies and we were not allowed to have a TV. Now, I did have a radio, and I found out that in some branches of this group, you're not even allowed to have a radio or read the newspaper. So if you don't have a radio, a TV, you don't read the newspaper, and there wasn't even a thing of going online back then, in 1965 when William Branham died. But they control that, I'm sure, very strictly too. They control all your information, other than just stuff you overhear other people talking about. And so cults work very hard to limit their members' access to information. Because if you read what other people are saying about this destructive group and you start wondering like, hey, yeah, what about that? Then that could be the beginning of the end of your membership in that cult. So B, behavior, I, information, T, thoughts. They control your thoughts. They tell you what you can believe, what you can't believe. They tell you what you can question and what you can't question. And the only things you can't question is every single thing they say. You cannot question the teachings of the group. That is absolutely not allowed. And 2 ways to find out if you're in a cult that are like unofficial. But if you start asking questions that sound like you're doubting the doctrines and the theology of the group, how do they react? Are they okay with that? Are they okay with freedom of thought? Or do they shut you down? Or do they shame you? Or do they guilt you? In the group I was in, if a person started questioning who we call Brother Branham, everybody in that group calls him Brother Branham. And it's just, I don't know, you get a bunch of message people around. We called ourselves message people because we were in the end time message. And we called our churches message churches. And you get a bunch of message people around, and you're just going to hear the word Brother Branham said, Brother Branham said, Brother Branham said, Brother Branham said. You can hear that over and 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 over again. So I was not allowed to wonder about a lot of things. And they had a very effective thought-stopping technique to help us not wonder about things. So if we were taught something by William Branham or over the pulpit by the local minister, and we did not understand it, and it did not make any sense at all, instead of just like pondering it and figuring it out or researching it and finding out what is really the truth about this thing, they had this thing called putting it on a shelf, which is also something that Mormons do. And I don't know if he got this from the Mormons. I'm kind of assuming he did, but I don't know that for sure. And putting it on a shelf means basically you stick something up on a shelf and you don't think about it anymore. Isn't that a good idea for the cult to tell you to do this with your questions? You just don't worry about the questions. You put it on a shelf and you ask God to show you. And then you don't worry about it anymore. And you just wait until God reveals it to you. And I had a lot of things on my shelf. And I joke around that my shelf got so heavy that it fell off the wall and it conked me in the head. And that's what got me out of the cult. But that's not really what happened. But I think it's a pretty funny image. And so that is such a great technique to get people who obviously are going to have questions. You can't hear all this stuff without having some questions, but it's a technique to teach people what to do with the questions that don't involve actually asking questions. So it's really ingenious, whoever came up with this. You're not allowed to think about all kinds of things. One thing you're not allowed to think about is that you don't want the end times to turn out the way William Branham said they would. And you're not allowed to think about the fact that following his teachings will ruin your life, because they will. And you're not allowed to think about a lot of things. And you're not allowed to think about the fact that he said many contradictory things. He told his life story quite often, and in some versions of his life story, he was very young when his dad died. He was like he said he only had a 3rd grade education because his dad died, and he had to hunt and trap and fish and provide food for his mom and his younger brothers and sisters. But in other versions of his life story, his dad died when he was in his 30s, and he preached his dad's funeral. Isn't that interesting? Both of those cannot be true. One of them is a lie. But if you notice that, instead of thinking like, oh, he lied, you just put it on a shelf, and then you don't worry about it. And then E stands for emotion. They actually tell you what you can feel and what you can't feel. And one thing you can't feel, like they tell you about God's plans for the end time. They're obsessed with the end times, like a lot of religious movements are, and especially cults are. They talk about it constantly, and really horrible things. Like, for instance, California just like crumbling off the side of, like, falling into the ocean and then causing a tidal wave that will go all the way to Kentucky. And when you think of all the millions of people that would kill, it's really scary. And they preach that, and then they say, and if you think any of this stuff is scary, then you're not of God, because this is God's plan and this is what God wants to do, but they don't add the part according to William Branham. And it's just, they tell you you're not allowed to be scared about certain things, or you're not of God. And you're not allowed to be angry that you're being oppressed by this cult. You're not even allowed to think about the fact or acknowledge the fact that they are oppressing the members. That is what causes a cult. And that's why that group that I mentioned earlier, who's only existing for 2 months, has 10 members, and worships rocks, is not necessarily a cult. It's not based on how old they are. It's not based on how many members they are. There are cults that have millions of members. There are cults that have been around a really long time. And it's not based on the weird theology. If you think about it, every religion's theology is weird to somebody, right? If you think about the virgin birth and Jesus walking on water, Jesus being crucified and then resurrected, that sounds very weird to somebody who was raised as a Hindu. And when, for instance, we see Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, that looks very weird to us. But that doesn't make Christianity a cult, and it doesn't make Hinduism a cult. Because cults it's all about how they treat people. Do they give people freedom? Another way to find out if you're in a cult, informally, is to just leave. And if you tell your pastor, I decided I'm going to go to this other church here, if they're not a cult, they're going to be okay with that. They're going to say, well, God bless you, I wish you well. If you are a cult, they're going to tell you that you're no longer of God and that you're not serving God because you're not going to that church anymore. And one very common characteristic of cults is saying that they're the only group that is right. So if you leave their group and go to another group, then you're leaving God and going to the devil. If you go to a group that you can't question things, you can't leave without being condemned, and you can't be in any other group and be right with God, there's a good chance you're in a cult. So we've got the 3 points that Rick Alan Ross makes about what cults are and what they do to people. And then we have the bite model from Stephen Hassan. So the next question is, who joins a cult? The most common misconception about cults is who joins them. Most people think people who join cults are dumb. Like, who would be dumb enough to join a cult? They're stupid, obviously. They're gullible. They're insane. They're very weak-minded. Only weak-minded people join cults, obviously. They're just too lazy to think for themselves. They want somebody else to do all the thinking for them. They're emotionally, sexually, and financially vulnerable. Those are the people that join cults, according to the popular opinion that's just floating around in the air. And the research shows that that's just not true. For one thing, if a lot of cults will not even let you be part of them. For instance, Scientology, you violate if you're a Scientologist, you actually violate your religion if you give to charity, or if you even give $1 to a homeless person. You're violating your religion. And if a homeless person wandered into a Scientology center, they would get him out of there as fast as possible. And that is based on what I learned on the YouTube channel called Growing Up in Scientology. So who does join cults? So a lot of this information that I've got right here is from a website called California State East Bay Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And the article is Cult Members, Who Are They? And a lot of their information comes from a book called The Sociology of New Religious Movements. And the author of that book is Lorne L. Dawson. And two of the first two characteristics are ones that I've heard from other people too. And then it goes on to a lot of other things. But often a person who joins a cult is very idealistic. They want to change the world. And it doesn't seem like the normal established places are doing it. So maybe you have to go out of the normal system to actually change the world. And they're in transition. And, you know, we all go through difficult transitions in our life, and that makes us vulnerable to a cult. So who are idealistic and who are in transitions? Teenagers are. Your whole teen years are transition. Transition after transition, transition going from a child to an adult. And who is idealistic? Teenagers are. Teenagers haven't been beat up in general, and hopefully most teenagers have not been beat up by reality like us grown-ups have. And they still believe that they could find a group that is the right group that could actually change the world. And so it's teenagers and young adults that often join cults. But that's not the only people that join cults. One characteristic is being open-minded. You have to be open-minded to join a cult, because there's this little group over here that nobody's ever heard of, and they're saying, you know, things that are different than everybody else is saying. Well, if you have a very closed mind, they're not going to make any progress with you. But if you have an open mind to new ideas, then that's a good thing. But at the same time, it opens the door to possibly joining a cult. And people that are looking for meaning and purpose in their life. If you have a life that you don't feel like is giving you meaning and giving you purpose, that also makes you vulnerable to joining a cult. Because they promise you will have meaning and purpose, and you will. The whole 28 years I was in the cult, I felt like I had meaning and purpose. I felt like I was serving God. I felt like I knew what God wanted me to do. I mean, my life was a total disaster. But I also felt like I had meaning and purpose. But often people don't feel that way. And if you run into a group that promises you they're going to give you that if you just become part of what they're doing, then you will have meaning and purpose, can be pretty attractive to people. And believe it or not, often people who join cults are better educated than the general public. And part of the reason of that is they are more open-minded. More highly educated people are more open-minded often than less educated people. And that is a very common thing. And most people who join cults are from middle or upper class families. And often they have less of a religious background. and are more open-minded about religious things. So if you have been taught what the Bible says since as far back as you could remember, and then you meet this group and they say, oh, well, we have the truth about what the Bible really says, and they're telling you all this stuff that you know contradicts what you know is in the Bible, it's very likely you're not going to listen to anything they have to say. But if they run into a person that doesn't even know what's in the Bible, like I didn't, then they have more of a chance of success. And as far as the education and the income, it varies widely between groups. For instance, the group I was in actually said that higher education is of the devil. And the only people in the churches I was in, like I said, there's all different branches and they're very, very different. But in the groups, the churches I was in, if there was anybody that had a college education, it was something they did before they joined the message. Just like maybe they used to drink before they joined the message. And actually, going to college was very frowned upon in that group. And also, that causes people to not have much money. Less educated people in general make less money. That's not always the case, but it often is. And so there are some groups that are super, super prosperous. For instance, Scientology. The Mormons are also a very prosperous group. Believe it or not, the Mormon Church, as far, not including the Vatican, because the Vatican is not in the U.S., but if you consider all the churches in the U.S., the Mormon Church is the richest. Its assets are at $263 billion. Billion with a B. Yeah, that's how much money they have. And so they are often, they really emphasize education, and they want their people to be prosperous. For one thing, because you have to tithe, which I don't know if you know what tithing means, but tithing is when you give 10% of your income to the church. The only question is, do you give 10% of the gross or 10% of the net? But you have to give 10%. And then another name, another less unsavory name, if you don't want to call it a new religious movement, which I don't like that title at all, because the age of the group has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not it's a destructive cult. But another name people have been using is a high demand group, and that is very accurate. If you are in a cult, you're in a group that is demanding your time, your energy, your money. And even when you're not at church, which you're at church quite often, then you are supposed to be doing things that serve the group, or that serve their idea of what you should do to be a spiritual person. So they're very demanding. So high demand group is a very good name. And then another reason why people sometimes stay in a group is they have what they call collateral. Believe it or not, this is a really awful thing. I never heard of this until recently. NXIVM and Scientology are two groups that do this. I'm sure they're not the only two. But they will have you sign a paper saying that you did this crime or that crime that you never did. And they will have you sign a paper saying that your mother did this crime or that crime that she never did. And they are talking about crimes that are some of the most despicable crimes you could ever think of. And I can't even really name them on here without using a lot of acronyms and spelling words out, but you know what I'm talking about. And they have those in a file folder, or probably a computer file. They have that on file with your signature. And so that's their collateral that they hold against you. So if you ever decide to leave, they're going to pull that out. And they're saying, look, she confessed to blah, blah, blah. And knowing that they have that about you is terrible. They can blackmail you with that. They can force you to stay. Another reason that people stay in cults when they want to leave is it is one of the hardest things, probably the hardest thing that a lot of people will ever do. It was definitely the hardest thing I ever did, was to leave the cult. And I didn't even have it bad compared to a lot of people. So if you leave a cult, often most people who are in cults were raised in cults. They were born to parents that were in the cult. Either their parents joined, or even their grandparents, or even their great grandparents. In Mormonism, it's very popular to talk about how many generations back your family goes, has been in the Mormon church. And so that's your whole world. And I have a friend, and he said that until he left the cult, he had literally never been in the home of somebody who was not in the message. That's just not part of your life. Other people are not part of your life. So I was a little different because I was the only person in my family that had joined this cult. Nobody else in my family was in the cult. And so I did kind of have a little bit of kind of two lives. And I didn't live a double life, but I did, when I was with my family, things were one way. And when I was with people from the church, things were another way. And in some churches, they would have tried to pressure me to not be around my family anymore. But I was very glad that I was never in a church like that, even though it was a cult church. And so when you leave, and often some members of the church own businesses, and then the other members of the church will work for them. And so they really like that because it's like your boss is a believer and all the people you work with are believers. And for instance, like in the church we were in, nobody was supposed to cuss. And so if you were working in a place where everybody was in the same group, you're not going to hear any cuss words. And you're not going to see a lot of things that you would see if you worked in what they call a worldly business, worldly because we're not of the world. And so that feels very comfortable, and people treat each other better, hopefully. And that is something. And sometimes some members of the church own houses and they rent them out to other houses. So tell me how hard it would be to leave a cult, the cult I'm describing. You're in this cult. You realize that the leader is a liar. You have caught him in a bunch of lies, and you don't trust what he says anymore. You realize that his teachings are not consistent with the Bible, even though he says they are. And you see the damaging effects on people's lives of people that are trying to live this way. And you don't want to be there anymore. And you don't want your kids to be there anymore. That's the sad thing, is the kids. And one of my big regrets is that I had my daughter in this cult church until she was 11. And I'm very happy that I got her out of there when she was 11. I wish I could say I got her out of there when she was 11 days old, but I can't. She was 11 years old. So, okay, you're in this church. You don't believe it anymore. You don't like it anymore. You don't want to be there. You don't want to be part of this group anymore. But you know that all your relatives will shun you if you leave the group. So you won't have a family anymore. You effectively will not have a family anymore. It's very possible your spouse will leave you if you leave this group. It's very common if one person in the marriage leaves a cult and the other one doesn't, for the result to be a divorce. You will have a lot less access to your children. And you'll know that when your children are with the other person, they will be taken to the cult church. And you know that they will be indoctrinated with the cult teachings. Every friend you have, every single friend you have is a member of the cult. Everybody in your family. Everybody in your spouse's side of the family. Because you're not going to marry. People aren't supposed to marry outside the cult. So every person in your side of the family, every friend you have, everything. Also, you're going to lose your job if you're working for a cult member. They're not going to keep you around. They'll find a legal way to do it, but they're not going to keep you around. And you're not going to want to be there anyway, because all they can talk about is the cult and what the cult leader says this, cult leader says that. It's really super uncomfortable once you leave a cult to be around cult people. It's just like horrible. And then maybe you're renting your house from somebody that is a member of the cult. Well, they're not going to want you in their house because you're probably going to be doing bad things in there, right? So the fact remains that if you leave a cult, you're losing a lot more than your religion. you're losing your entire social structure. Cults in general, at least the one I was in, people look out for each other. People help each other. And your support group is your cult. And your family is part of your cult. Your friends are part of your cult. Your job comes from the cult. And your home comes from the cult. So tell me, what are you going to lose in that case if you leave the cult? Only everything except your soul. You could walk out of there totally empty-handed, have no relationships with anybody, and have nothing left. Because usually you give all your money to the cult. That happens. That happens to people. And they still have the guts to leave. And I admire that so much. So how do we know about really the deep down thing of how cults operate? It's called brainwashing. And the man who actually came up with the 8 elements of brainwashing, which he didn't like that term, he preferred the term thought reform. So we're going to call it thought reform, but thought reform and brainwashing are the same thing. This one's a popular term and one's a more technical term. His name was Robert Lifton. He was born in 1926, and in my research I found out he's still alive. He's 99 years old. I think that's pretty cool. Well, from 1951 to 1953, he was in the Air Force. He was a psychiatrist, and he was a military psychiatrist working in Japan and Korea. And beginning in 1953, he interviewed American servicemen who were POWs as part of the Korean War. He also interviewed priests, students, teachers, and Chinese people who were subjected to indoctrination. Communist China at that time, I don't know about now, but at that time they had a very effective program of indoctrination. They could take somebody who didn't agree with their teachings at all, and I'm not saying it worked on everybody, because I'm sure there were people it didn't work on, but they knew how to break you down and then get you the way they wanted to get you. So he wrote a book in 1961 based on these interviews. And the book is called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, a study in brainwashing in China. And a thought terminating cliche is a saying that was popularized in that book. And a thought terminating cliche is, if I'm sitting there pondering, like, why did this thing happen? And I'm talking to another person, or even just talking to myself, and I was, well, God works in mysterious ways. That's a thought terminating cliche, because I'm thinking, why did God let this happen? Why did this happen? And then to stop me, the other person or I myself do it to myself, which we do all this stuff to ourselves just as much as they do it to us, because we learn how to do it and we do it to ourselves even more than they do it to us eventually. Why saying God works in mysterious ways is a thought terminating cliche, because that stops you from thinking about it. Or just saying, well, it's in God's hands. That's a thought terminating cliche. Like, God's will is good even if we don't understand it. I mean, there's 1,000,001 different ways to stop thinking by using these cliches on ourselves or using them on other people. They're very effective, unfortunately, because we should be allowed to think. Again, using a thought terminating cliche goes into the T of the bite model, thoughts. Thought terminating cliches are another way to control thoughts. So Robert Lifton came up with 8 elements of thought reform. We're going to talk about these real fast. The first one is milieu control. And that means they control your environment. They put you where they want you to be, under the conditions they want you to be in. They isolate you. They control your communication. You can't communicate with anybody you want to communicate with. You only communicate with who they want you to communicate with, and they control your information. That goes back to the I in the bite model. So the information, they control that. And he called that milieu control. And a lot of these people were in prisons and in prisoner of war camps. And if that's not milieu control, I don't know what is. The second element is called mystical manipulation. And what happens here is these groups orchestrate events that seem like they're spontaneous, but they are not. And they manipulate the person into accepting the ideology of the group. And they confirm the divine authority of the group. So if you're at a preaching campaign and all of a sudden everybody gets all anointed and starts speaking in tongues and starts, I don't know, like wailing and, being in the spirit and rolling around on the floor and all the other stuff that can happen, that can seem like a very spontaneous thing that just breaks out and that God made happen. But actually, the people that run these things know exactly how to make this happen. They use music. Music is a huge way to get people to do what you want them to do. It's very easy to get people who are swaying, and they'll have somebody say the same line of a song over and over and over again, and that's called chanting. Chanting does make you go into altered state of consciousness. And there's a lot of ways that what they call worship and how they use the music, and they know what they're doing. I'm not saying that every one of them does, but I've heard from people that say they know exactly what they're doing. And I believe that because it's orchestrated. It's all orchestrated. It's not spontaneous. But yet you're there and you're, oh, wow, God's moving. This has to be the right group. So the third is a demand for purity. And that is about a black and white view of the world. Everything is either good or it's either bad. It's either of God or it's of the devil. And I was taught that in the cult I was in, that everything is either of God or the devil. There's no in between. Well, it's not true that everything in the world is black and white. There are a lot of shades of gray. And they want to have a very simplified idea of how the world works. And this world actually is not simple at all. It's pretty complicated. And they have an emphasis on conformity. And the other thing they have is they put this unattainable standard of perfection in front of you that you're supposed to attain. Even though it is unattainable, it's impossible. You cannot succeed in meeting these standards. That's just not a thing. And so that causes all kinds of guilt and shame. And you feel like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be where God wants me to be? What's wrong with me? How come I keep sinning? Because you're human. And you're not perfect. And you're never going to be perfect. Not on this earth. The fourth thing they do is confession. And they made people confess in very explicit terms. And this leads to self-incrimination, false accusations, and vulnerability. If you're in a group setting and everybody is like praying and in the spirit, and then somebody says, I really regret doing blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but I did. And then everybody starts sort of confessing their sins. And then the next thing you know, you're confessing your sin. And then you go home like, oh no, why did I tell anybody I did that? That puts you in a very vulnerable position. Kind of like the collateral I was talking about. It's not written down on paper. It's not a formal thing. But it's pretty common that like I told people stuff that I really regretted telling them. The fifth thing is sacred science. Their ideology is presented as the absolute truth that cannot be questioned or criticized, and the leader is the sole interpreter of the truth. So if they say something, then that's the truth, period. There's no, well, what about this or what about that? And just to tell you one of the absolutely idiotic things that William Branham said, two of them actually. He said that stars are little bits and pieces of the sun that broke off. That's what he said stars were. And yet, since he's the cult leader, I really wonder, I didn't even know he said that when I was in the cult. I mean, he preached, we have like over, I think, 1,100 and something tapes of sermons of his, and he just rambles about all kinds of different things. It's really hard to keep track of what he even said, and until they made transcripts of all these sermons, and now these sermons are searchable online, and that is causing people to find out the truth about what he said. But I listened to those sermons constantly. I read the transcripts constantly. I didn't know he said that. Another thing I didn't know he said, and this was supposed to be a prophecy, that supposedly he said in 1933, but nobody has ever heard him talk about it before the 50s, and still not accurate. He said that Roosevelt dragged the world into war. Not Hitler, mind you, Roosevelt, which is ridiculous. So what do you do if you're in a cult and the leader is saying this idiotic junk? You can't question it. You can't criticize it. You cannot even think about whether it's true or not. I remember believing some totally stuff that I knew was totally unscientific. I believed it because William Branham said it, but yet I also kind of believed what I had learned in school, and so I put it on my shelf. Again, a thought terminating technique. Instead of thinking, wow, he was wrong, that's not right, what is he talking about? Then I didn't worry about it anymore. So that is just so effective. Whoever came up with that was an evil genius. The sixth one is called loaded language. Every one of these groups has jargon or vocabulary with specific meanings that are incomprehensible to outsiders. And that limits critical thinking and promotes conformity. It also promotes a us versus them mentality. And again, on the Growing Up in Scientology channel, they are the worst about this. They have acronyms for everything, and they use all these words that mean something totally different than them than they do to us. They actually have a 2-volume dictionary just so they can keep track of what all these words mean. But after you've been in it for years or you were raised in it, you know what they all mean, but other people don't. And sometimes Aaron, his name is Aaron Levin Smith, he would have guests on there who were Scientologies. He has lots of Scientology guests and they're ex-Scientology. And he would say, okay, I'm going to talk to them right now like I'm a Scientologist. And then they would talk back and forth, and it was like they were talking in another language. It was all these acronyms and all these sayings. Like, what does that mean? Like, you do that for maybe a couple minutes, and then he was like, okay, back to normal, And there is a book called Cultish, which came out recently, that really focuses in on this, like, unique jargon or vocabulary. And I'm going to just tell you a few of the things that that I know what the end time message means by these sayings. And I don't know. I would be really curious what you guys think they mean. What does it mean to apply the token? What does it mean to be the 7th church age messenger? What does it mean to be a manifested son of God? What is serpent seed? Those are just the ones that I can think of right off the top of my head. And most people don't know what that stuff means because, for one, a lot of those like phrases that are more than one word, they're made up. Or like applying the token is actually from the book of Exodus, but it's used in a totally different way in this cult. So again, they either make up something and they give it a meaning, or they take something that already exists and give it a different meaning. So 2 people can be talking to each other that are in the same group, and then a third person could be there and they have no idea what they're talking about. That is definitely us versus them kind of thing. So the 7th one, this really hit home. It's called doctrine over person. Personal experiences and individuality are subordinated to the group's doctrine. And in the cult I was in, it didn't matter what the results of following the teachings of the group were. It didn't matter one little bit. What mattered is that you obeyed. And if the result of your obedience was that your life was a living hell, like mine was, because of my marriage, then you have to just do it anyway. It doesn't matter what your experience is. Experience matters not at all. What matters is that you obey the doctrine taught by the leader of the group. And then the 8th one, and I'm going to give you, I wrote down an example. So women are not allowed to wear pants. Well, what do you do if you live in the Arctic? Are you going to get frostbite on your legs? Go outside in a dress? And people up there have to wear pants. They have to wear like a snow suit. I've never lived in Alaska, but they have to wear appropriate dress for the climate. But then the message women will put a dress on over those pants just to show like that they're not wearing pants, even though they are wearing pants. even though there's nothing wrong with wearing pants. And there's definitely nothing wrong with wearing pants in places that if you don't wear pants, you're going to get frostbite. But they put that dress on it just so everybody else see that they're wearing a dress, which it's sad. It's just really sad that people even have to worry about stuff like that, but you do. And so the last one is dispensing of existence. This group knows who has the right to exist. Outsiders are lost and unenlightened, and those who leave are unworthy. And every one of these really hits home to me. When I first read this, I thought the message hit 6 of them. Now I feel like it hits all 8. And this is so true. Like, they tell you that the message, the end time message, which is believed by a couple million people all over the whole planet. More people believe this in Africa than anywhere else. It's a lot more common there than it is in the US. But it exists all over the place. And in small little groups here and there. And so they say that everybody else is not saved. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or if you're not. I mean, nothing else matters. If you're not following the end time message, you're just not a Christian. You're not a real Christian. You might, I don't know, make it in on some other like lower level of person, but you're definitely not going to be in the rapture. You're not going to be, which is another thing they teach. And it says that those who leave are unworthy. No, it's more like those who leave are the devil, at least in the end time message. You can't leave that place. You can't leave that group without being labeled. And I was really fortunate. Again, I wasn't in a super bad extreme version of this. And I didn't even know how good I had it because I didn't know what the other churches were doing. They will shun you. They want you to go to hell, according to a friend of mine who was in a much more extreme version of this. They want you to go to hell because you left. And two of the phrases that I absolutely hated even when I was in the cult are cannon fodder and dog meat. Do you know what cannon fodder is? William Branham claimed that God created almost everybody on earth to be cannon fodder, which in an old-fashioned battle, the people in the front were the ones that were going to be hit by the cannonballs, and they would put their least valuable men in front of the army. Like, they would rank people. And if you were in the very front and you were getting guns fired at you and cannons fired at you, you probably were going to die. And he just felt like that those people didn't have any reason to exist except for to die. So he called them cannon fodder because they weren't of God. And another, do you know what dog meat is? That's another loaded language in this cult I was in. Dog meat is any woman who wears makeup. Isn't that disgusting? And the reason they're called dog meat is because in the Bible, the Queen Jezebel wore makeup. And they talked about Jezebel all the time. And in a lot of Christian movements, they're still talking about Jezebel and the Jezebel spirit and all this stuff about Jezebel, blah, 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 blah. Well, Jezebel wore makeup, and when she died, she fell off a balcony, and a bunch of dogs, supposedly because she was such an ungodly person, a bunch of dogs came and ate most of her body. And they licked up her blood off the pavement, which is pretty gross. And so they called women who wore makeup dog meat. And even when I was in the cult, I absolutely hated those two sayings. Dog meat and cannon fodder. They're just absolutely disgusting. And I will link some videos that I have made. I'll link a video about how I got in the cult, how I got out of the cult, my life when I was in it, and about the rules of the cult, and about what William Branham said about women. And I will also definitely put a link to Amazon links in the video so you can get the books. If you're interested, you can get the books that I mentioned in this video. I will make sure that I put every one of them on there. And thank you for watching this. If you're still watching this, thank you. And I would love to hear what you guys think. Have any of you been in any kind of cult? We didn't explore the details of all the different types of cults that exist because I haven't been in any other kind of cult. I was in a 2-person cult. My marriage was a cult. He was like the cult leader under the cult leader. My ex was. And then it was like a tiny cult inside of a bigger cult. And I think a lot of the marriages in that cult are 2-person cults because the cult gives the husband all the power. And if there's such a huge power imbalance in a group, it's quite easily can become a cult. And ours definitely did. And I think a lot of other ones did. I'm not saying everyone. I'm not saying every man in that group treated their wife bad because they didn't. But there were an awful lot who did, unfortunately. So thank you very much. And I would love to hear what you have to say. I would love for this to turn from a monologue to a dialogue, and get comments from you guys and respond and have a conversation in the comment section. And please like it and subscribe if you're interested in this. And I appreciate this very much. Have a great day. Bye.